Good evening. I'm wearing a very ancient Greek costume, which I'm just showing off to you while people join in. It's a strange garment, which many of the characters that I'll be talking about tonight might have considered wearing, perhaps. That's what I'm channeling this evening. Thanks so much for joining. It's great to have you here with me this evening. And I'm just checking before I get going that I really am broadcasting to the world, unlike last week when, unfortunately, I seem to be only broadcasting to myself, which was somewhat frustrating. So if anyone's on Facebook, I'd love you to make yourself known, because it was Facebook that failed me last week purely through my own ineptitude, I have to admit. So yeah, do tell me if you're there on Facebook, anyone, and say hello. There's lots of people I'm seeing on Instagram, which is fabulous. And yes, Kate's there. Thanks, Kate. I'm so glad to see you. And I'm really relieved because last week I thought I was talking to the world, but nobody appeared. And it was all very distressing because it seemed that nobody loved me for my talk on transgender literature, which was a topic that I really enjoyed researching. And please do feel free to watch that episode on my YouTube channel or on Instagram, IGTV, or indeed on this Facebook page. So tonight we're going to be talking about classical retellings, which is why I'm wearing a kind of Greek makeup and costume tonight. And I was inspired to do this particular topic very largely by the fabulous Natalie Haynes, who is one of my favourite modern authors. She's written many fantastic books which are inspired by the classics because she is a classicist. She studied the classics and she speaks very passionately and wonderfully about classical issues in many formats. She's actually been doing a series of YouTube videos called Ovid Not COVID, which are hilarious because Natalie is also a stand-up comedian as well as being an amazing writer. So the book that I wanted to start off by telling you about is Natalie Haynes's A Thousand Ships, which is a bold retelling of the Iliad that's panoramic and playful, yet makes a serious comment on war and its true cost. And all the books that I'll be talking about this evening do delve into war because the classical world of Homer and any of the other authors that we're going to be looking at involved war, death, rape, destruction, the gods behaving terribly, and it was a somewhat brutal world that they lived in. So in A Thousand Ships, Natalie Haynes uses many different characters who were in the background of the events that were happening as told by Homer. She takes the female voices from the muse Calliope to Clytemnestra, whose daughter Iphigenia was sacrificed for the sake of the wind so that Agamemnon could go to war. Agamemnon was Iphigenia's father. He sacrificed his own daughter in order to get the wind going for their voyage to Troy. It's not surprising that Clytemnestra was deeply peeved with Agamemnon and vowed to get her revenge on him, which she verily does in this incredibly gripping, brilliant, and highly complex book. It's actually got so many characters in it that Natalie has had to do a list of characters at the beginning of the book so that you can keep a grip on who's who. And All of them are people that you would have heard of from your classical studies, I'm sure, such as Circe, who we're going to be talking about later this evening, Iphigenia, Clytemnestra, Hermione, Odysseus, and so on. But it is quite complex, but I love the way that Natalie weaves the different voices together in this book. It's a multi-tongued book, which, like its title, has 1,000 different viewpoints, but it's actually a really gorgeously compelling read. And I'm going to read you just a couple of little bits from it to give you a flavour of some of the writing in this book. One of my favourite characters in 1,000 Ships is Eris, the goddess of strife. And I'm just going to read to you a little bit about her. Eris, goddess of strife, hated to be alone, but that was how she spent most of her time. In the dark recesses of her cave dwelling, halfway up Mount Olympus, home of the gods. Even her brother Ares, the god of war, preferred to avoid her nowadays. She remembered how they had once been inseparable. Just children squabbling over a toy, pulling at each other's hair to settle the dispute. How she missed him, now he was absent from Olympus. Where had he disappeared to this time? She was always forgetful, but she tried to think, although the black snakes she wore twisted around each wrist were distracting. Thrace? Was he sulking in Thrace? But why? She pushed the scaling creature back down to her left wrist. Because of Aphrodite. That was it. Ares, she thought of him spitefully even as she missed him, was always involved with someone or other, but the affair with Aphrodite had been more consuming than most. Eris couldn't remember who had told Aphrodite's husband about it. Had it been Helios, god of the sun, in case you'd forgotten? Had he seen them sneaking around together while Hephaestus was away? The sun god saw everything, after all, if it happened during the hours when his light illuminated the world. But he couldn't be looking everywhere at once, could he? Or his horses would drive the chariot off course. So had someone mentioned it to Helios, encouraging him to point his gaze in the right direction? But who would that have been? Eris had the faintest recollection of the last time she'd spoken to the sun god, but although she sensed it was quite recent, she couldn't remember when it had been or what they had discussed. So that gives you a little flavour of Eris, who is a very spiteful and malicious creature. She is the goddess of strife. And it becomes apparent in that chapter, brilliantly written by Natalie Haynes, that Eris is responsible for some terrible things that happen later in the book. It's all very gripping, and there's a lot of, as I was saying earlier, rape, death, destruction, and sacrifice. One of the things that I actually found difficult about this book is the many sacrifices of children and innocent children being thrown off the ramparts of cities, their throats being slit by their mothers to save them from inevitable marriages to the enemy, or being sacrificed ritually so as to cause the opportunity for wind to come, and so on. Susie, you're mentioning Eris also causes quite a lot of commotion with the golden apple, which is very true, and actually that comes into that scene, which I was going to read, but I realised there's just too much to get in to this evening to tell you about. So I really do urge you to read this book. It's a real gripper. It's brilliantly written. It's very full of wonderful stories, and it's absolutely fascinating. Nicola, you're saying that you love the relationship with the gods. I agree. And you also mentioned that it's a great book on Audible, which I completely back up, and would say listen to it on Audible if you don't have access to the book itself. Another great character, before I move on to another book in A Thousand Ships, is Penthesilea. There's a few names which I might find difficult to pronounce tonight, and that is one of them. She is an Amazon girl, one of the Amazons who were the warrior race of women who are incredibly fit, and Penthesilea ends up in battle with Agamemnon. And there's a really fantastic flashback to her childhood, which I found one of the most moving sections of the book, because Penthesilea comes to a sticky end, like so many of these characters in the Greek myths. But we have a lovely glimpse of what it was like for her as a child. She's talking about her sister Hippolyta here. And the games they used to play, running up the slopes, picking up white pebbles, or an abandoned bird's nest, running back to the bottom of the hill to add it to a pile of woodland treasures, each one eyeing the other's growing hoard with envy, marvelling at her swiftness and strength. And the speed test, which Hippolyta always won. The two girls would stand beside one another on open ground and count themselves down. Ready, steady, go! Penthesilea would fit an arrow to her bow and shoot it high in an elegant parabola. At the same time, Hippolyta would begin to run, laughing at her own ability to cover so much ground so quickly that by the time the arrow began to descend, she was waiting, ready to catch it in her hand. She never failed until the last time. And so Penthesilea had lost her sister, dearer to her than life itself. Not only that, but she had killed her. An accident, the other said, trying to comfort her. As though there could be any consolation for this. And because she had lost the thing she held most dear, and because she had not merely lost it, but had herself destroyed it, and because there was no possibility that she could go on living without Hippolyta, Penthesilea resolved to die. What I love about the book also is the way that Natalie Haynes manages to get so much into a small section of the book. So it is a book that has many stories, but it's also one that is not at all confusing. I think people that would read it, have read it, would agree. She's very good at packing a lot into a small space of time and a small section of the book. Natalie Haynes has also written two other brilliant books, which are The Children of Jocasta, which I also hugely recommend, which is based on Sophocles' Antigone and Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which I know is not the right way that I meant to say that. And I can't remember the correct translation. Sorry, Natalie, if you're listening. But The Children of Jocasta is another fantastic retelling of the Antigone story, and we're going to come to that later this evening with another version of Antigone. And, Oedipus Tyrannus. That's what you're meant to say. You're not meant to say Oedipus Rex. Oedipus Tyrannus, because that's the Greek, not the Roman translation. And Natalie Haynes also wrote The Amber Fury, which is a modern retelling of an ancient myth starring the Furies. And that's also a really fantastic novel set in a school where a teacher gets very involved with her students. So it's much more of a actually modern version of the story. And furthermore, Natalie has recently published this gorgeous book, Pandora's Jar, which is all about, as you can see from the cover, women in the Greek myths. And this is non-fiction. It's a kind of learned description of many different women in the Greek myths, from Pandora to Medea, and the different ways that they've been presented in fiction over the years. So that includes modern popular culture as well as 18th century versions of the myths and so on. So we got Pandora, we have Penelope, we have Phaedra, we have Eurydice, we have the Amazons. They're all in here. So that's also a really fantastic read. So many great myths to talk about this evening and myth retellings. So having just mentioned Antigone, I would love to bring to your attention Camilla Shamsi's Home Fire. If this is a book that you haven't yet read, it's a really superb modern retelling of the Antigone story as told by Sophocles. But this story takes place in London and in Pakistan. And I'll just rewind a bit and tell you about Antigone before telling you about Home Fire for people that might not know the Antigone story. So in Sophocles' play Antigone, a teenage girl is forced to choose between obeying the law of the land. Her uncle, the king of Thebes, has forbidden the burial of a traitor, and religious law, because the traitor is Antigone's brother Polynices, who has declared war on his city and killed his own brother Eteocles along the way. So Antigone's good brother gets a funeral and the bad one is left to rot. Leaving a relative unburied is profoundly taboo in ancient Greece. So Antigone must decide, does she obey her conscience and bury her brother? And if she does, she gets the death penalty. Or does she obey the law and leave her brother to be picked apart by dogs? It's a pretty appalling decision, and one which, being a Greek tragedy, has tragic consequences. Now, this story has been retold incredibly cleverly by Camilla Shamsi in this book, Home Fire. It's such a great novel. You can read it without knowing that it's a retelling of Antigone, and it's still going to be really gripping and compelling. But if you know that it is a retelling of Antigone, you are reading it thinking, oh, I wonder how she's going to bring in the brother and how she's going to bring in the death of the brother. And then what about the whole burial side of it? So in Home Fire, the beating heart of the novel is a girl called Anika, who has a twin brother, Parvez, who's left London to work for the media arm of ISIS after discovering that his absent father died en route to Guantanamo. Her sister Isma tells the police where he's gone, and Anika, the heroine, is horrified at what her sister has done. And this is all true to the Sophocles version of the tragedy. She says, you betrayed us, both of us, and then you tried to hide it from me. Don't call, don't text, don't send the pictures, don't fly across the ocean and expect me ever to see your face again. We have no sister. This is a very typical Sophoclean moment, which Camilla Shamsi manages to bring into the modern novel and make completely believable. There then ensues much drama until Anika's twin brother Parvez is shot and killed. Sorry to give you spoilers, but knowing that it's an Antigone-based story, you won't be surprised that people die and then the consequences have to be faced. So Parvez is shot and killed, and then his body lies unburied in a kind of no man's land in a city in Pakistan, and nobody is willing to go out and bury the body. And it's horrifically hot. There's a really awful intensity of the heat beating down on the people and the body beginning to succumb to the laws of nature and to start smelling. So it's all incredibly visceral and grim. And Anika flies over to be with her dead brother. Meanwhile, Eamon Lone, who is her fiance, who has had various complexities throughout the book that I won't go into, which have made them possibly alienated, also decides to step into the breach and come to the rescue. And the denouement, I felt, was absolutely brilliant, and I won't give away what happens, but it is really fantastically in tune with Sophocles, and I feel it really works with the spirit of the original tragedy. So that is a really excellent retelling of an ancient myth, and one that I deeply recommend to you. So then, moving on from Camilla Shamsi, another great novel that has come out in 2018 is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is a really brilliant retelling again of the Iliad. So these two books are telling stories about the same period of history, whether it's mythical or real. My Greek head necklace keeps falling down. Sorry about that. And Pat Barker's version of the story is very intense. It recounts the events of the Iliad chiefly from the point of view of Briseis, who is the princess who becomes the prize of Achilles. So the plot begins when the Greeks, led by Achilles, sack the town Lyrnessus. Sorry about my pronunciation. It describes the looting and burning of the city, the massacre of its men, and the abduction of its women, including Briseis, who is the childless wife of King Mynes. Then, when the women are handed out as prizes to the Greek raiders, Briseis, who's very beautiful, is awarded to Achilles. In all of these books, the women are given out as prizes gaily, and that in itself is all quite shocking. And of course, in these modern retellings, we get to see how the women feel when they're given out as prizes, often having just witnessed their brothers all being killed, put to the sword, thrown off the edge of the walls of their city, and seen their fathers fighting and dying too. And then they're given as gifts to the very men that killed their relatives, and they have to suck it up and deal with it. So it's pretty brutal stuff. The plot of The Silence of the Girls then becomes the same plot of the Iliad, but from Briseis's point of view. And she tells it all pretty much in the first person, with occasional interjections from Achilles, so we get his internal state of mind as well. But what makes it really fantastic is Briseis's own voice and the way that we witness her from the start when her city is being sacked. We witness all her horror, all her misery, and her slow acceptance of her new fate as Achilles' concubine. And she loves the sea. She goes swimming every morning in the sea. And the smell of the sea on her skin, he finds completely irresistible, because he himself is the daughter of a sea nymph. So that's all a bit strange and intriguing, and gives a new slant on the story. It is an important, powerful and memorable book that invites us to look at the Iliad in a new way, but also it makes us think about all the voices of people in battles whose stories remain untold. So I just want to read you a little bit of it to give you a flavour of this book. There's so many passages in all these books that I want to read, but I'm trying to keep them not too long this evening because of having so many books to talk about, because it's such a rich vein of fantastic literature. And actually, before I read more from The Silence of the Girls, I'd love to ask you, why is it, do you think, that we love reading tales of the Greek gods in this day and age? Why in 2020 are there all these amazing books that everyone's reading, floating around, that people want to know about and to discover more about the Greek gods? I think it is a fantastic escape going back a couple of thousand years to another time. It feels like a time that was unreal. The fact that there's so much major drama, there's people being brutally killed, there's prophecies, there's elements of magic, there are furies, there's justice, there's very rough justice, and there's also hideous unfairness. I think in our current time, where politics have gone pretty insane in the last year, and with COVID, the world has seemed like a very harsh and brutal and unfair place. I feel that turning back to the classics makes a lot of sense. But if you have other ideas, I'd love your thoughts and comments. So now I'm going to read you a little bit from Briseus's point of view in The Silence of the Girls. What I remember the most, apart from the awful, straining, wide-eyed terror of the first few days, is the curious mixture of riches and squalor. Achilles dined off gold plate, rested his feet in the evenings on a footstool inlaid with ivory, slept under bed covers embroidered with gold and silver thread. Every morning, as he combed and braided his hair, and no girl ever dressed more carefully for her wedding day than Achilles for the battlefield, he checked the effect in a bronze mirror that must have been worth a king's ransom. For all I know, it might have been a king's ransom. And yet, if he needed a shit after dinner, he took a square of coarse cloth from a pile in the corner of the hall and set off to a latrine that stank to high heaven and was covered in a pelt of black, buzzing flies. And on his way there and back, he would have to pass an enormous rubbish tip, which was supposed to be burned off at regular intervals, but never was, and consequently had become a breeding ground for rats. That's the other thing I remember, the rats. Rats everywhere. You could be walking along the path between two rows of huts, and suddenly the ground ahead of you would get up and walk. Oh yes, as bad as that. The skinny, half-wild dogs that roamed the camp were meant to control the rats, but somehow they never did. Mernon, who was in charge of the upkeep of Achilles' compound, used to organise the younger fighters into rat hunting contests with prizes of strong wine for the winner. You'd see young men strutting about with rows of little corpses impaled on their spears. Rat kebabs. But however many they killed, there always seemed to be plenty more. That gives you a little bit of a flavour of Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls, which I thoroughly recommend as a great, if quite harsh and occasionally depressing read. Many of you will be familiar with The Song of Achilles and Circe by Madeline Miller, both of which are fantastic and gripping novels. Madeline Miller wrote The Song of Achilles in 2012, and it took her 10 years to write. The story is told from the perspective of Patroclus, who is the lover of Achilles. Now, in this version of the story, it's a steamy love affair, which in Homer is not so explicit. Patroclus was exiled by his father to live in the court of Peleus, and soon he fell in love when he was exiled at the age of 10 with his host's son, the superhuman Achilles, who from childhood, being a demigod, was swifter, more beautiful and more skilled than all his peers. And Natalie Haynes, writer about the classics, as well as writing her own novels, says Miller's prose is more poetic than almost any translation of Homer. Iphigenia, sacrificed by her father Agamemnon to appease the goddess Artemis, is described as having a tripping name, the sound of goat hooves on rock, quick, lively, lovely. And when Briseis, the concubine Agamemnon later steals from Achilles, gradually learns Greek from Patroclus, her words were like new leather, still, stiff and precise, not yet run together with use. So Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles is a beautifully written novel which really brings to life the intensity of war and the love between these two men. I found it a deeply affecting version of the Achilles story, in which Achilles becomes a fully three-dimensional man. He's a son, a father, a husband, and a lover. And he has, in many other stories, come across more as a superhero, but in this, he actually seems very human. So I'll just read you a little tiny bit of it, which is about when Patroclus first meets Achilles and how he feels about that. He played my mother's lyre and I watched. When it was my turn to play, my fingers tangled in the strings and the teacher despaired of me. I did not care. Play again, I told him, and he played. Whoops-a-daisy. Sorry about that. That was my phone falling off my computer. So I'm just adjusting that. Sorry to Instagram watchers there. And now it's gone kind of dark. It all looks fine. Somebody give me a wave on Instagram so that I know that it's still okay. I think it is. Oh, that's better. I think I've got the light back. I do apologise. So I'm in the middle of giving you this little reading about Patroclus. Play again, I told him, and he played until I could barely see his fingers in the dark. I saw then how I had changed. I did not mind anymore that I lost when we raced, and I lost when we swam out to the rocks, and I lost when we tossed spears or skipped stones. For who can be ashamed to lose to such beauty? It was enough to watch him win, to see the soles of his feet flashing as they kicked up sand, or the rise and fall of his shoulders as he pulled through the salt. It was enough. So I'm realising that I'm going to run out of time if I read everything that I wanted to read from tonight's selection. So I'll just have to leave you with telling you how brilliant that book is. Do read it if you haven't read it yet. It's also fantastic on audio. Then we must mention Circe, also by Madeline Miller, published in 2018, which is another fantastic version of a character who is in the Iliad, but is not really given much of a character or in-depth analysis. Whereas in Madeline Miller's book, we get a whole novel about this really fantastic character. So Circe is the daughter of Helios, the god of the sun and the mightiest of the Titans. But Circe is a strange child when she's born. She's not powerful like her father, nor viciously alluring like her mother. She turns to the world of mortals for companionship. And when she does that, she discovers that she does possess powers, the powers of witchcraft, which can transform her rivals into monsters and menace the gods themselves. So Circe is a fantastic character because she's in a way a bit of a downtrodden, immortal character who has to cope with being somewhat neglected and underappreciated. And I have met many women that have loved reading Circe because it's a very empowering novel. It's a novel that makes you feel like you can find your true self and let that true self flourish, which is exactly what Circe manages to do herself as the novel progresses, though it does take her a bit of time. So she falls in love with Glaucus, who is a mortal, and because she loves him so much, she discovers that she can use herbs and potions as a way of making him immortal, which she then does. But it's a fatal move for her, because once he's immortal, he gets ideas above his station and completely decides to ignore her. She's devoted her whole life to him up until this moment and done the amazing act of immortalizing him. And he turns his back on her and starts flirting with Scylla, the nymph, who is a bit of an old jade. And she is really not that interested in Glaucus anyway. But Glaucus becomes obsessed with Scylla, says he's going to marry her, at which point Scylla decides, right, I've had enough of that. I'm going to transform Scylla into the evil bitch that she really is. I'm going to bring out her true self, because that's what Circe is good at doing with her potions. So she mixes a potion, puts it into the sea where Scylla likes to go and swim. And Scylla, much to everyone's horror, including Circe's, actually turns into this hideous monster with many serpentine heads, who then is regularly seen throughout Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, and also in Circe, as a monster ready to lure men to their deaths. So Circe is not somebody to mess with. I just want to read you a little passage which describes how Circe realizes that she has this wonderful ability with potions. It is hard to describe what happened next. A knowledge woke in the depths of my blood. It whispered that the strength of those flowers lay in their sap, which could transform any creature to its truest self. I did not stop to question. The sun had passed the horizon by then. Glaucus's lips had fallen open as he dreamed, and I lifted a handful of flowers over him, squeezing. The sap leaked and gathered. Drop by milky drop, I let it fall into his mouth. A stray bead landed on his lips, and I slid it onto his tongue with my finger. He coughed. Your truest self, I told him. Let it be. I crouched, another handful ready. I would squeeze the whole field into him if I had to. But even as I thought that, a shadow moved across his skin. It darkened as I watched. Past brown it went, past purple, spreading like a bruise until his whole body was deepest sea blue. His hands were swelling, his legs, his shoulders. Hairs began to push out from his chin, long and copper green. Where his tunic gaped, I could see blisters forming on his chest. I stared. They were barnacles. Glaucus, I whispered. His arm was strange beneath my fingers, hard and thick and slightly cool. I shook it. Wake up! His eyes opened. For the passing of one breath, he did not move. Then he leapt to his feet, towering like a storm surge, the sea god he had always been. Circe, he cried, I am changed. However, he doesn't stay as a good friend to her for very long. And the book takes you to the island to which Circe is banished after she transforms Scylla. And she then meets Ulysses and has many adventures, which you will discover when you read it yourselves. It's a great read, deeply recommended. Again, fantastic either to read to yourself or get someone to read it to you or listen to it on audio. Madeline Miller is a really great writer. Don't hesitate to delve into that immediately. Another excellent recently published novel, well, it was 2005 in fact, is Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad, which is all about Penelope's point of view as her husband, Ulysses, is careering around the world, going off to fight in a Trojan War that he really didn't need to do. He's the king of Ithaca. And she has to wait for him for 20 years. So Margaret Atwood says, Homer's Odyssey is not the only version of the story. Mythic material was originally oral and also local. A myth would be told one way in one place and quite differently in another. I've chosen to give the telling of the story to Penelope and to the 12 hanged maids. The maids form a chanting and singing chorus which focuses on two questions that must pose themselves after any close reading of the Odyssey. What led to the hanging of the maids? And what was Penelope really up to? The story as told in the Odyssey doesn't hold water, says Margaret Atwood. There are too many inconsistencies. I've always been haunted by the hanged maids, and in the Penelopiad, so is Penelope herself. So that's from Margaret Atwood's introduction to this book. And this is another book a bit like A Thousand Ships, in which there are many voices, and we move from voices of the hanged maids, who are a kind of chorus, to the voice of Penelope herself. And that's what makes it a fun and interesting read. Some of it becomes slightly academic, some of it's like a chorus in a Greek tragedy, and some of it is much more of a typically Margaret Atwood dramatic tale. I'm going to read you a little bit from the chorus, which is the hanged maids who were all killed when Ulysses returned from his 20-year voyage around the world. They were very unfairly murdered, as is evident. It's called, this section is the chorus line, a rope jumping rhyme. We are the maids, the ones you killed, the ones you failed. We danced in air, our bare feet twitched, it was not fair. With every goddess, queen and bitch, from there to here, you scratched your itch. We did much less than what you did. You judged us bad. You had the spear, you had the word at your command. We scrubbed the blood of our dead paramours from floors, from chairs, from stairs, from doors. We knelt in water while you stared at our bare feet. It was not fair. You licked our fear. It gave you pleasure. You raised your hand. You watched us fall. We danced on air. The ones you failed, the ones you killed. Those maids do haunt the story, as Margaret Atwood said, and they are a horrible, tragic image, which is brutally described in many versions of these tales. But I did find their voice in the Penelopiad particularly powerful. And I'm just going to read you another passage from the book which describes the death of the maids, not from their point of view. This is from Ericlia, who is part of the household who have remained on Ithaca with Penelope while Ulysses was travelling around. But which maids? I cried, beginning to shed tears. Dear gods, which maids did they hang? Mistress, dear child, said Ericlia, anticipating my displeasure. He wanted to kill them all. I had to choose some, otherwise all would have perished. Which ones? I said, trying to control my emotions. Only 12, she faltered. The impertinent ones, the ones who'd been rude, the ones who used to thumb their noses at me. Melantho of the pretty cheeks and her cronies, that lot, they were notorious whores. The ones who'd been raped, I said, the youngest, the most beautiful. My eyes and ears amongst the suitors, I did not add. My helpers during the long nights of the shroud, my snow-white geese, my thrushes, my doves. It was my fault. I hadn't told her of my scheme. They let it go to their heads, said Heraclia defensively. It wouldn't have done for King Odysseus to allow such impertinent girls to continue to serve in the palace. He could never have trusted them. Now come downstairs, dear child. Your husband is waiting to see you. What could I do? Lamentation wouldn't bring my lovely girls back to life. I bit my tongue. It's a wonder I had any tongue left. So frequently had I bitten it over the years. Dead is dead, I told myself. I'll say prayers and perform sacrifices for their souls, but I'll have to do it in secret, or Odysseus will suspect me as well. So that gives you a kind of inkling of Margaret Atwood's approach to the Odyssey, told through Penelope's eyes. And that is another great read on this mythical adventure that we're taking tonight. Another one I'd just like to mention is Where Three Roads Meet by Sally Vickers, published in 2012, which is an interesting and unusual novel, part of the Canongate Myths series, which Margaret Atwood's book is also one of their number. They've done about 10 myths rewritten by modern authors, all of which are brilliant. And Sally Vickers recasts Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos as a duologue between Tiresias, the prophet, who survives from the play, and Freud. So Freud is one of the main characters in the book, and this is taking place in Maresfield Gardens in London in the late 1930s. So Freud is in his final exile from Vienna, and he is having conversations with Tiresias, the prophet. And some of you may remember from last week's session that Tiresias is an unusual and wonderful prophet who was blinded, but also had lived both as a man and a woman. So he's a really interesting character. And that's a really interesting, shorter book, which is more of a kind of modern analysis of a myth rather than a retelling. Mythos by Stephen Fry, I'm sure many of you will be aware of, is a really great retelling in Stephen Fry's inimitable fashion of as many myths as he can pack into one book. Because he couldn't pack them all in, he's now written another book called Troy, which is more of the stories that we've been talking about tonight. But Stephen Fry is great company. He tells these stories brilliantly, and that's another great read. I'm not going to go into detail about it because I'd rather focus on the female writers this evening. And I would like to end this session with a lovely new book, which is Zeus is a Dick, which is a kind of comedy version of all of these myths that we've been discussing this evening, written by Susie Donkin and her daughter Coco Hapner, mother and daughter team. And it's a book which is a fantastic read aloud. It's also great to read to yourself. It's written in a very informal style, and to listen to it on audio is particularly brilliant, read by Susie Donkin, one of the authors, the mother in the mother-daughter team. And she does read it fantastically, and it's absolutely laugh out loud funny. I'm going to read you a couple of passages from it to give you a flavour of how hilarious it is. She does it much better, so you would do very well to listen to it yourselves. You can probably get a sample of it on Audible and then purchase the whole thing. But it's a great book which I would thoroughly recommend for classics enthusiasts. as a really funny look at all of those characters that we've been discussing this evening, Zeus and his cronies. And it describes exactly why Zeus is a dick, for lack of putting it in a more traditional style. Susie Donkin says in her introduction, in this book, I've chosen the funniest stories, the ones where the gods really screw up, the times their egos and sex drive get the better of them, and we see them for what they are: horny, insecure, conniving, paranoid, vain and petty. In other words, profoundly human, but with a few godly add-ons like winged sandals and immortality. So let's stop revering them and start laughing at them, as the ancient Greeks intended. And I'm wholly behind Susie Donkin there with her appreciation of the hilarity of the gods. And if you read this book, you really will see all the absurdities that Zeus gets up to. I'm going to read you just a couple of little bits so that you can get an idea of how the stories go down. Here's one passage about Rhea, who is Zeus's mother. Rhea gets to spend 2 blissful months in Crete, where she eats barrel loads of hummus before giving birth to a beautiful, healthy boy. She names the child Zeus and leaves him with a child-minding nymph called Adamanthea, who is all like, yeah, I'm great with children. You don't have to worry. I'm one of those natural mothering types. And then as soon as Rhea has gone, she dangles Zeus from a rope that's tied to a tree so that he can't go anywhere. Anyway, Rhea goes back home and Cronus is like, you look well. And she says, it was a really positive birthing experience. And he says, great. Now hand over the baby. And Rhea says, course, doll, and hands him a rock in swaddling clothes. And because gods give birth to some weird things, Cronus doesn't even question it. He just swallows the rock whole and never thinks of it again. The gods have an amusing habit of swallowing their children. And as the authors say in Zeus is a Dick, if in doubt, if you've got a problem with someone, try swallowing them, which does seem to happen rather frequently in this book. So just another little section from here. So Zeus, fully clothed again, sneaks into Cronus's palace, and the first person he sees is Rhea, and he thinks, wow, another hot babe. And Rhea thinks, wow, why have I never noticed him before? And there's a lot of electricity flying about, but then she sort of squints her eyes and looks at Zeus, and somehow, I don't know, call it mother's intuition, is like, you're Zeus. And Zeus is like, yeah, and Rhea's like, OMG, you're just like your father. At which point Zeus remembers he has a job to do. There's some very, very, very funny passages in this book. I was splitting my sides, and I have to say it's great in both written form and audio form. And I think it's a really good addition to all these fantastic books that have come out in the last couple of years. And indeed, during lockdown, this one came out, because we all need fantastic stories which are not necessarily about the here and now in order to feel better about life currently. So there's so many more brilliant mythical retellings. If there's any that I've missed out that you want to mention, please highlight them as a message on Facebook, send me a private message on Instagram, or email me on ella@ellabear2.com. Next week, next Wednesday night, the 2nd, I'm going to be talking about my books of the year. So the best books that I've loved this year, and also books that I would recommend for Christmas presents. So that will be a special kind of pre-Christmas edition of this evening. And I will also be doing, the week after that, I'm going to be doing a special on my favourite Christmas stories. We all love a Christmas story, and I think it would be really fun to look at a few fantastic Christmas stories that you might want to read together with your loved ones, read to someone in your house, or read over Zoom even, if we're still in lockdown. I think it's always a lovely thing to try and read to distant friends and loved ones over a video call, perhaps. And on the 16th of December, I'm going to be doing a special Damien Barr Literary Salon live at 9 p.m. on the subject of snow in literature, which I'm really looking forward to. There's so many fantastic books that really delve into snow. Maybe we'll even get some snow. You never know. So thanks so much for joining me this evening. Great to see you all here. And I'll see you next week. Good night.